Welcome to session 1 of Systems Beyond Life, Trends that Shape the Future. I'm going to tell a pretty complicated story that begins with human successes and ends with unpreparedness. And the key ideas today are problem solving and problem prevention. There is a Chinese curse, or at least it's claimed to be a Chinese curse, that says, "May you live in interesting times." So perhaps we do. In 1972, there was a think tank called the Club of Rome that was tasked with predicting the future. And they wrote a book called Limits to Growth, and it was a typical example of systems thinking and systems theory. They modeled the change and interdependence of a number of key variables in our societies, and they made multiple scenarios. And one scenario was called business as usual. And that scenario is visualized here. And it shows a period until 1972 in which the model was calibrated. And then we have a period between 1972 and now, 2020, in which they expected this. And we can, in principle, we can check this. But in 2020, you see that all the lines are changing fairly rapidly, and things are changing a lot. So we might ask, is this a good model, and did it lead to realistic expectations? Well, in about 2010, the model was revisited, and the period between 1972 and 2010 was filled in with the new information. And here you see the same information as on the previous slide, but now more accessibly presented in terms of the environment, resources, pollution, the economy, food, industrial output, services per capita, things like that, and the population on the the right panel, where you see birth rate, death rate, and the combination of the two, the population. And basically, the predictions were not at all bad. In terms of the stocks, the resources, maybe there were more resources than they originally expected. And there are two estimates here. One is a stock estimate, how much resources do we have? And there is a flow estimate, how much of the resources can we make available? And especially the flow estimate seems to correspond pretty decently with the model prediction. And resources, they drive everything, and in particular they drive the economy, because you need energy, you need food, etc. to feed people, to have economic activities. So if we look at the industrial output per capita, for example, we see that it's actually a pretty good result. It's for food per capita down here, we see that actually there is more food than they expected, and hence we have an obesitas problem in the world at the moment. It's pretty interesting. And we also have more services per capita, and that entails that we have more debt. We basically took material from the future to the current time by saying that we're going to pay later, and that is the debt. In terms of population, they overestimated the death rate and they underestimated the birth rate, but eventually the population levels were more or less like predicted. So the model seems to be decently realistic. What they wrote at that time in 1972 was that they blamed the human predicament to a failure in systems thinking. And they wrote, "It is the predicament of mankind that man can perceive the problem, yet, despite his considerable knowledge and skills, he does not understand the origins, significance, and interrelationships of its many components, and thus is unable to devise effective responses. This failure occurs in large part because we continue to examine single items in the problem without understanding that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That change in one element means change in the others. And that was Donella Meadows in 1972, one of the lead authors. So let's see what are these claims made in 1972 actually hold. So are we unable to devise effective responses? Well, if you take the book from Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, he has a whole list of human successes. For example, our lives, they are much longer. Life expectancy changed from 30 years to 70 years in the last centuries. Child and maternity mortality are much down. Health is much better, and that is because of sanitation, better houses, but of course also medical advances. Quality of life is much up. There is much less work time and more leisure time. We have fewer wars, there is much more democracy, there's more equality, there's more education. Safety is up a lot, especially all kinds of accidental deaths, natural disasters. We have much less of them, at least we don't have less disaster, but we are able to cope with them better. Crime is much reduced. Hunger is down a lot. We have food for the masses. We had a green revolution that produced lots more food for the growing human population. Our wealth is up. The poor are much less in extreme poverty, and the wealthy are much more wealthy. And we all use very much more products. So these are real successes, you would say. But let's see whether they are really effective. So are we unable to devise effective solutions? If you look at the previous slide, no, we are able to devise effective solutions. But let's go into them in some detail. Let's first go to, for example, health, and in particular the childhood diseases like measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, whooping cough, and diphtheria. We have numbers from an old paper, a 1970s paper, that stemmed from 1900 until the 70s, and that showed that all those diseases, they were going down. And they were going down very effectively, orders of magnitude in many cases. And that was the result of sanitation, much better housing, more healthy habits, and that really explains a lot. But also, at some part, there were vaccines introduced. So the whooping cough vaccine and the measles vaccine were introduced in about 1950 and about 1965. But they didn't actually do so much, because the trend was already very clearly down. And that is interesting, because now they were introduced the moment that the death rate of these diseases that was serious that were already down. So let's look at their position in the causes of death in general, and then we see that the causes of death in general are typically heart disease. They are cerebral vascular diseases, cancers of all kinds, respiratory diseases, etc. Here the scale changes, so these are the most important ones. And vaccines, they target this part, but we have all the diseases here that are in part lifestyle diseases, and we hardly address them. And then there is another thing. In 1975, people were more poor, and now people are less poor, but they're also much more obese. So instead of eating not enough, we are now eating too much. And obesity is correlated with all the previous diseases very strongly. So we have focused on vaccines, but we allow people to become obese and therefore to become unhealthy in all kinds of other ways. And the obesitas is really the elephant in the room. In terms of its effects on the society, it is much more important than the bird flu and maybe also the corona situation right now. And it might also be a much bigger influence than global warming. So obesitas is the elephant in the room, and we have allowed it to happen. So this was focusing on an isolated problem, like can we save people from the measles, and we completely missed the obesitas effect. So in general, you can conclude here that health has improved a lot, but that does not entail that it was a very efficient use of time and energy. So let's think a bit about what efficiency actually is. And a very useful concept is Pareto's principle. And it started with an observation, originally that 80% of Italy's wealth belonged to only 20% of the population. And Pareto, he studied that and he eventually generalized it so that he concluded that 20% of the effort typically produces 80% of the result. And so if you have 80% of the result, then you need another 80% of the effort to get a maximal and optimal result. And that is interesting. So at some point, after we got 80% of the result, we probably start in generally optimizing in a very inefficient way. So let's see if we can find examples of that. This is life expectancy versus GDP. So if you look at GDP per capita, if it is very low, then life expectancy is also very low. So that is in this area. But if it is high, then life expectancy hardly changes. And actually, this here is the Pareto point. Depends a bit what you take as 100% or maximal, but this is at $5,000, $2,005 per year per person. And then we already have pretty much most of the life expectancy. And these countries have 5 times as much GDP per capita, and this is even almost 10 times as much. So here we are optimizing life expectancy in a very inefficient way. The same we can say about the Human Development Index, which is on this axis, which is maximal or very low, versus the total primary energy footprint. And here again we have a Pareto point of about 80% of the effect, and above 80% we can spend more and more energy, but it is not as effective as you would think, especially here. This is almost flat here. So do we have higher GDP and energy use than we actually need? That's a good question. So on a global scale, this is a very good question to ask. And we can look at the Green Revolution. In the Green Revolution, we increased our cereal production by a factor of 2, but we needed 8.5 times as much nitrogen fertilizer. And nitrogen fertilizer requires a lot of energy. And this is the same picture. The upper part is nitrogen that we need, and so we needed much more nitrogen, but we also needed much more water and much more phosphorus. And we definitely needed a lot more pesticides down here. So we're needing lots and lots more for actually a fairly modest increase in yield. Well, factor 2 is it's a lot, but if you need so much resources, And then we have the alternative, which is organic farming. Organic farming is not as efficient on the large industrial scale, but it's also not super inefficient. So if you look here at the difference, organic is typically about something like 20 or 30% less effective or productive as industrial farming. But here is the Pareto point. So 80% of the result can be produced with organic farming, almost 80% of the result, without nitrogen fertilizers, much less water for irrigation, much less phosphorus, and no herbicides and pesticides. So that's actually quite interesting. So we are turning non-renewables unnecessarily and wastefully into food. At least that is a question that you might raise. So let's look a bit at energy and economic growth. And the relationship between them is very, very strong. This is a graph that shows that per capita GDP dollars, that it rises almost linearly over 3 orders of magnitude with the energy that we consume. So every 1,000 GDP dollars, they cost about 1 gigajoule per year per person. And that is a lot of energy. And this is a very strong result. And that holds for all kinds of different countries. So this is all kinds of lines showing the development of different countries. And we see that the difference is fairly big. Some typically of the either very cold or very warm countries with cooling systems are pretty high, and other countries are much lower. But the difference between top and bottom here is a factor 20. So it suggests that we can realize the same GDP with much less energy. But in general, it's not what we do. So what can we conclude from all these examples? Well, we solve problems typically in isolation, and we overshot. We changed malnutrition in obesitas. We changed enough GDP in more GDP. We can realize super yields in all kinds of products and like corns and so, but we need a lot of energy and resources for it, while we have an alternative that doesn't deplete non-renewables. We invest a lot of vaccines while we allow obesitas to be actually the elephant in the room that has much more effect on health. And I haven't even talked about planned obsolescence for light bulbs, computer, and especially in fashion. In order to look nice, we change our clothing every year, which is an absolute waste. So the Club of Rome, they concluded, or they said that a change in one element means a change in others. But what is the connecting thing? And the connecting thing is mainly energy and time. So if energy wasted here means energy lost elsewhere, and time wasted here means time lost anywhere. There are all kinds of other interconnectednesses, but this is the main important one. So energy and time, they always connect it all. We have only limited energy and we have only limited time, and a good society uses it well. Let's think a bit more about how much energy does it cost to produce energy? And that is a very interesting question. And that goes to the concept of energy return of investment. In 1930, investing in 1 barrel of oil allowed the production of about 100 barrels of oil. In 1970, we only could realize 30 barrels of oil from 1 barrel of oil investment. And now we can only produce 11 barrels of oil. So it takes ever more investments to pump oil out of the ground. We still become better in getting it out of the ground, but we still need more oil to get the oil out of the ground. Here, in the beginning, the useful energy was about 90%, 99%. In 1970, it changed in 97%, and now the useful energy is 93%. So we are losing fractions of useful energy to pump more difficult oil out of the ground. And that is connected to a topic that is called the net energy cliff. This is EROI in terms of the fraction of the energy useful. So that can be 50 or 2 on one side. And the percentage of useful energy. So it's just the definition of EROI. And we used to have in 1970 about 90% useful energy. But now we are going into a direction in which we get 80% useful energy. And we know that because we are pumping shale oil out of the ground. So shale, that is here, and we are busy with photovoltaic energy. And we are also using tar sands already. And we have wind energy that is somewhere over here. We still have some oil and gas that is very cheap and that we can easily out of the ground. But we are moving more and more in this direction, and more these types of energy become feasible. Well, the problem is that our societies might need a level of about EROI of about 14 in order to function like we do at the moment. So the problem is that we got the easy oil first, and now we are here. So let's go into that a little bit more. In 1971, someone called Hubbard came with the idea of the theory of peak oil. And he predicted that at about 2005 we would be at peak oil. Peak oil is the combination of two things. It is one, the energy that we know we have. So in 1971 it was about this, but we knew we would find more. And so we found more, and we used less than we found. But at this moment, which he predicted at 2005, we would end up in a situation in which we would not find more than we were using. And from that moment on, we would deplete our stocks of oil, and we would also be able to produce less and less. So that is this part. So this is the quantity of the known quantity of oil left, its stock estimate. He predicted this in 1971, but it seems that peak oil, we might have had it, but it might also be about now, so in 2020. But he had a stock estimate. And if you combine this picture with EROI, you get something like this, which is a flow estimate indicating how much energy there is for the economy. And this part here is how much energy we need to extract energy. And now we are here at the peak, and after the peak, the decrease in useful energy is much quicker than we originally estimated. And that is interesting. So let's go back to the Club of Rome. In 1972, they made all those predictions, and they predicted the resources, and this is about the resources halfway. So maybe we are now at that point. And that means that we are now, if you look at all the other graphs, peak services, peak resources, peak food, and peak industrial output. And that makes our current time actually a pretty interesting and maybe somewhat frightening time, because our societies produce solutions for, well, the past, not even the now anymore, and definitely not for the future. And if you don't have solutions for the future, you will have a future world full of problems. And that connects us to the coping trap versus adequacy. So when you have a world of problems, that indicates that you are in a coping trap, in which your solutions to problems needs to lead to new or more problems that need solutions that lead to new and more problems, etc., etc. And you become very good in problem solving. What we didn't do is to create a world of opportunities, because you need to be adequate for that. You need the skill or ability to solve daily problems quickly and effectively, or to avoid them altogether. That is problem prevention. And it seems we didn't do that. But let's look at problem solving and problem prevention a little bit better. They are not on the same axis. Preventing problems and solving problems are not the same thing. Why? The opposite of preventing problems is allowing problems to arise. And let's think, what is the opposite of problem solving? Well, changing the situation is the result of problem solving. You had a problem and you solve it, and therefore you have a new situation without a problem. So the opposite of problem solving might actually be allowing the situation to persist, or some form of acceptance. And we can connect this with the coping trap, inadequacy, or adequacy. So now we can say something about the 4 different quadrants. This is a quadrant in which problem prevention is important, but you're not super self-assertive. You allow situations to persist. You're not going to change them too much. This is an area in which problem prevention is important, and you are self-assertive. So you change the situation. Here you're constantly dealing with problems, but you try to solve them all of the time. And here you're dealing with problems, but you're not self-assertive, so you allow the situation to persist. And in order to make more sense of this particular picture, we need to go into social values. What are social values? Social values are shared values that allow individuals who do not know each other to contribute constructively. And they are very important. In general, you can say that values are beliefs inextricably to affect. They refer to desirable goals that motivate action. Values transcend specific actions and situations. They serve as standards. Values are ordered by importance relative to one another, and the relative importance of multiple values guides actions. So pertain to moods, to morals. They are holistic, they are measures, they lead to priorities and lead to decisions, and therefore values are really important. And the Swatch World Value Survey surveyed about hundreds of thousands of people. So we asked them about their values, and all the results were combined, and they fit actually with this picture. So let's see how they fit. So this is a result from the Swatch Value Survey. All the different points here, like choosing your goals and being clean and equality, etc. They are all different values that are important for some people, for these people here, and other values are different, are important for other people. But this is the field. So typically, if you have values like this, you don't have values like that, because they are opposite. Or if you have values here, then you don't have those values here so much. So let's gradually go into the structure of this. But before, look at this. Here, in this direction, intelligence is a value that is highly valued, and that is associated with problem solving. And in this direction, we have wisdom, and wisdom, it makes perfect sense to associate that with problem prevention. And if we go in this direction, like problem prevention, self-assertive, what type of things are important? Well, a varied life, choosing your goals, being curious, having freedom, being creative, all those things make sense from that perspective. If you go here with problem prevention and not being self-assertive, and then you prefer a world of peace, mature love, presenting the environment, equality, spiritual life, you help people, those kind of things. They are not overtly changing the environment so much, but they are contributing to an environment that is stable and is without too much problems. If you go in this direction, then you deal with problems, but you're not self-assertive. So you're moderate, you accept your portion in life, you respect tradition, you're obedient, you're polite, you find family security important, so those kind of things, and you optimize those kind of things. And then in this area here, so that would be high intelligence and allowing problems to arrive. You deal with problems, but you're very self-assertive. How are you? By being influential, by being authoritative, wealthy, having social power, being successful, etc. So this all makes sense. And one question that you could ask, and that I definitely asked, is this core cognition? The same figure that I showed before. Well, let's see. The core cognition is the cognition shared that I claim by all of life, and I showed it like this. So core cognition has this axis, an eventful deactivated, eventful activated, and this main axis, pleasant viable and pleasant unviable. And we want typically to go into this direction. And then have pleasant viable here, wisdom, world of beauty, unity with nature, broad-minded, creativity, all those kind of things are here. Many options, choosing your goal, being curious, independent, varied life, also creativity fits in this direction. Eventful life, well, pleasure, enjoying your life, daring, influential, those kind of things. High complexity life is a life in which you can solve problems, in which you can reduce the complexity of the world by imposing your authority on it, by buying influence, by having social power, by being influential, etc. An unpleasant, unviable world is a world in which you have problems with a sense of belonging. And you find it very important to belong to something, in which you have a problem with preserving your own public image or your health, or which you're not sure that your favors are reciprocated. Or national security is an issue. So this is a problematic situation that we typically want to avoid. In this situation with few options, you want to be obedient, moderate, you accept your portion in life, you have respect for traditions. And then here, an uneventful deactivated life would be to be forgiving, having a spiritual life, being humble or devout. Or what is very uneventful and deactivated in the sense of not overtly influencing the world. So let's go a little bit closer into the different quadrants in this picture. So in here, the key part is that the reduction of social complexity is very important. Why? Because other agents, they are actually doing all kinds of things that make your life and the world more complex. So this is about reduction of social complexity and the curtailing of the behavior of everyone that does the wrong thing. And it's very much self-centered on protection. People here like control. And in this corner here, we are in a problematic situation with not so many options. So we are interested in the protection of our existing options. And we typically self-curtail our behavior by being obedient, by having respect for tradition, by being humble, moderate, accepting your portion in life, etc. You conform typically, you don't stand out. It is very much a group-centered protection. So if you behave like everyone else, then you have the protection of everyone else. And this is what you could call the submitter quadrant, while the previous quadrant was the controller quadrant. Then we go to the upper right quadrant, where self-development is very important, where it is about extending your own behavioral repertoire. So therefore you explore. It is self-centered on possibilities, on self-development, and the word belonging to this is inventors and initiators. And then we have the last quadrant. That is the quadrant that is very good in holistic development, improving the whole, improving everything in the context of everything else, and therefore serving society, serving the whole, serving nature. It is very much group or centered development, and the word associated with that is typically caregivers. So now we have 4 sets of values that shape the future, and they are influencing our moods, morals. They are holistic, they are measures of our own, but also the behavior of others. They define our priorities and our decisions, and they are structured like this. And I think that the current dominant paradigm is reduction of social complexity, curtailing behavior in all kinds of different ways. We problematize isolated problems, issues, and solve them in isolation. We are very much self-centered on protection, and control is very much shaping our current society. But that's only one of the 4 value sets that we are able for. But the interesting question is, if you go to this picture, here was the intelligence, here is the wisdom, so now we are at a lack of wisdom and high intelligence. So the question might be, are we currently at peak intelligence and peak foolishness at the same time? So let's think what happened in this session. I started with the Club of Rome, and so far they created in 1972 very realistic expectations, but the rest of society did not think about them and did not create very realistic expectations. This was a typical example of systems thinking. It was not a focus on solving problems in isolation, like you see a lot with mono, inter, and interdisciplinarity. That typically leads to solutions that create problems. I focused on improvements of the whole, and I use that as a measure to judge our solutions. And that is a transdisciplinary approach. There you prevent problems typically by focusing on how you use your time and energy best from a holistic perspective. And we also saw those 2 modes of cognition, problem solving and problem prevention, as 2 axes, the prevention axis here and the intelligence axis there. And we saw that clearly being present in the structure of values. And those values underlies all kinds of important trends that shape the future. So I would say, it's values that underlie the future even more than economic trends. So returning to limits to grow, is there a failure in system thinking? Are we unable to devise effective responses? Well, in isolation we are able to devise effective responses, but from a holistic perspective we are unable to devise effective responses. And we created solutions for the here and now and the past, but not for the future. And we might be at a point where previous solutions will not work anymore, and we have to go to new solutions that we didn't prepare that might be suitable for the future, might be suitable for the future. So we examined too many things as single items, and the changes in one element mean change in the other is clear now, because everything is connected via time and energy and our use of both. So we are not as prepared for our future as we could. So what does it mean for you? Well, evolution is about projecting yourself and your genes in the future, and we were not doing that maybe as well as we could, but it needs realistic expectations, and that is a weak point in our currently dominant value set at the upper left. But it's not outside of our range to create realistic expectations. a group of people did that already in 1972. It is probably unlikely that you can continue with your business as usual scenario. Our lives, your lives are going to change pretty quickly after now. And you can therefore prepare for a different future, a future with less resources, but still with ample opportunities to optimize quality of life. So let's go to the graphical summary. We talked about sustainability. That is very difficult in our current situation because you have to optimize the whole and not solve isolated. Of your personal development, you have to become not only good in problem solving but also in problem prevention. On thinking, it is that our values shape the future, so you have to include those values in order to understand your own thinking, and Pareto's principle is a very useful tool as well. On feelings, there's a very strong link between values and social trends. They influence your moods, your decisions, your motivations. The opposition of today was mainly unrealistic versus realistic and inadequate and adequate things. The quadrant was the value quadrant. The systems idea is that isolated problems versus holistic optimization are two completely different things that are perpendicular to each other. Concepts were social values, EROI, net energy clef, and the Pareto principle. The references of today are these, and I hope to see you again at Predicting the Future, the next session.